Most people spend their whole lives waiting for someone else to tell them they are enough. Carl Jung watched this happen over and over again in his clinic. He sat across from patient after patient who had given everything to everyone around them and had nothing left. Not because they were weak, not because they were broken, but because they were terrified of one simple thing: choosing themselves. Jung had a word for what happens to a person who spends their entire life performing for others instead of becoming themselves. He called it a kind of psychological death, not the dramatic kind, the slow, quiet kind, the kind you do not even notice until you wake up one day and realize you have no idea who you actually are. Society has a way of making you feel like putting yourself first is wrong. It tells you that sacrifice is noble, that always being available, always agreeing, always shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's space is something to be admired. But Jung looked at that idea and said something brutal. He said the person who refuses to choose themselves does not become a better person. They become a ghost. They disappear. This slow disappearance is one kind of psychological death, the stagnant kind. Nothing is confronted. Nothing is transformed. The person simply hollows out over time, still performing, still accommodating, but increasingly empty at the center. Jung knew there was a second kind, a necessary one, the death of the false self. Because the only way to find the face beneath the mask is to be willing, for a terrifying moment, to take the mask off. The first death destroys you without giving anything in return. The second breaks you open so something true can emerge. Jung believed you would face one or the other. The question was, which one you would choose. This video is about that disappearing act. It is about the mask we wear to be loved, the anger we bury when we are not chosen, and the terrifying blood and sweat work of finally claiming your own worth. Jung called this process individuation, and he believed it was the only path to a life that actually means something. But before we get there, I want to sit with something, because the disappearing act Jung described is not dramatic. It does not happen in one explosion. It happens in small, quiet increments. Every time you swallow a feeling to keep the peace. Every time you agree with something you do not believe, because disagreeing feels risky. Every time you make yourself smaller so that the person next to you can feel bigger. Jung noticed that the people who do this most consistently are often some of the most intelligent, perceptive people he ever worked with. They learned, somewhere early in life, that their authentic self was not safe, that it needed to be managed, softened before being offered to the world, and so they became very good at managing it. The problem, as Jung would show, is that what we manage eventually manages us. Jung gave the mask a name. He called it the persona. The word itself comes from the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. In his psychology, the persona is the face we create for the world. It is the version of you that smiles at dinner when you are hurting. It is the version that agrees in meetings when you disagree. It is the version that says, "I'm fine," while quietly breaking apart on the inside. Now, the persona is not evil. Every human being needs a social face. We all shift slightly depending on the situation. That is normal. That is survival. Jung never said to throw the mask away. A doctor needs a different face in the operating room than at home. A teacher needs a different presence in the classroom than with close friends. The persona allows us to navigate the world. The goal was never to be maskless, but Jung identified something dangerous that happens to a huge number of people. They stop seeing the mask as a tool they use. They start believing it is who they actually are. They forget the face underneath, and the mask stops being a choice and starts being a cage. When that happens, Jung wrote, the person does not just wear the mask wears them. Think about someone you know who is endlessly agreeable, someone who never seems to have an opinion of their own, someone who shifts their personality depending on who is in the room. From the outside, they look easygoing, flexible, kind even. But Jung would look at that person and ask a much harder question. He would ask, "Where did you go?" Because behind all that bending, behind all that adapting, there is a real self that has been slowly buried alive. Jung wrote that the persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society, a kind of mask designed on one hand to make a definite impression on others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual. That word matters, conceal. The mask does not just shape how others see you, it eventually shapes how you see yourself. You look inward, and you see the mask looking back. The real face is somewhere behind it, but it has been so long since you checked that you are not even sure it is still there. And this is where people stay for years, sometimes for whole lifetimes, not because they are weak, but because the mask became the strategy for survival very early on. As a child, maybe being agreeable was how you kept the peace in a home that did not feel safe. Or being useful was how you earned affection from a parent who only showed warmth when you were helping. Or being quiet was how you stayed invisible enough to avoid punishment. The persona does not always start as vanity. Often it starts as wisdom. The tragedy is that the rules of one room followed you into every room after it. The price of wearing the persona too long is not just exhaustion, it is identity. You lose the thread back to who you actually are, and once that thread is lost, self-worth becomes impossible, because you cannot value something you can no longer find. But here is where it gets even darker. Jung discovered that when you refuse to choose yourself, when you spend your days performing the version of you that everyone else needs, something very specific happens to all the emotions that get left out, all the resentment, all the frustration, all the longing to just be real for one single moment. Those feelings do not disappear. They have nowhere to go, so they go underground. Jung called this place the shadow. The shadow is not simply the messy, inconvenient parts of yourself. That is a common and too comfortable misunderstanding. Jung was far more precise. The shadow holds your genuine capacity for cruelty, your envy, your rage, the parts of yourself you find reprehensible, not just awkward. It is the sum of all the qualities you deny in yourself most fiercely and condemn in others most violently. Jung observed that the people you despise most intensely are often mirroring something you carry and refuse to acknowledge in yourself. Empaths aren't broken, they're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. But the shadow is not only darkness, it also holds buried gold, suppressed creativity, unlived courage, needs and desires shamed out of you so early you forgot they were ever yours. Every emotion you were told was wrong to feel. Every part of yourself you suppressed because you were afraid it would make people love you less. Darkness and dormant potential, locked in the same underground room. That combination is what makes the shadow so critical to confront and so dangerous to ignore. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow. He said the less it is acknowledged in a person's conscious life, the blacker and denser it becomes. And here is the brutal part. The shadow does not stay quiet forever. It finds its way out, not in clean, obvious ways, in sabotage, in explosions over small things, in the way you snap at the people you love most, in the relationships that keep falling apart, and you cannot figure out why. When you do not choose yourself, when you constantly give while secretly resenting the giving, that resentment poisons everything it touches, your relationships, your health, your ability to feel any joy at all. Jung saw this pattern so consistently in his clinical work that he came to believe it was not just a personal problem, it was a psychological law. Suppressed self-abandonment always finds a way to express itself, and it rarely picks a convenient moment. Here is the part most people never want to hear. Jung observed that the people who present the most selfless, giving faces to the world, are often the people carrying the heaviest shadows, not because they are secretly cruel, but because the more you suppress what is real in yourself, the more pressure builds in the unconscious. That pressure does not care about your intentions. It will find the crack. It will come out sideways. This is why you see it happen. The endlessly patient parent who suddenly says something they can never take back. The devoted partner who one day feels nothing and cannot explain when it stopped. The agreeable colleague who, after years of nodding along, explodes over something trivial. To the people around them, it looks like a breakdown. But Jung would say it is the shadow finally getting its turn to speak. And the tragedy is that by the time the shadow speaks that loudly, the damage is already done. The relationship is fractured, the trust is broken, the person is left confused about who they even are, because that explosion felt nothing like the self they had been performing for years. This is the real cost of not choosing yourself, not just your own suffering, the suffering of everyone, depending on a version of you that was never sustainable. Consider a composite example based on the patterns Jung observed repeatedly. Imagine someone who has built their entire life around being needed, a person who wakes up every day calculating what everyone else requires from them. They feel useful, they feel valued, but underneath, there is a voice they have been ignoring for years, a quiet, persistent voice asking, "But what do you need?" Every time it surfaces, they push it back down, because choosing themselves feels selfish, dangerous, like a betrayal. Jung would say this person has confused self-abandonment with virtue, and the shadow of that choice is already building. Now we come to what Jung called the brutal truth. He once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Read that again. Because Jung was not being poetic, he was being precise. The terror is real. Accepting yourself completely means accepting the parts that are messy and inconvenient and not what people want from you. It means accepting your needs as legitimate, your limits as real. That you cannot keep giving from an empty place and calling it love. Jung rarely framed the goal as self-worth in the modern sense. He talked about wholeness. He talked about self-realization. What he observed was that genuine self-worth was not the destination. It was the byproduct. It arrived when a person had done enough of the real work to finally feel whole. Jung would say it this way: wholeness is forged through the tension of opposites within the psyche, through the confrontation of the light and the dark, the mask and the face beneath it. It is not something you claim with an affirmation. It is something you arrive at, battered and more honest, on the other side of the individuation process. Jung had very little patience for the idea that you could think your way into valuing yourself. He believed wholeness was built through the long, difficult, sometimes painful work of becoming who you actually are. He called this individuation, and he was deeply honest about what it costs. Individuation means confronting the persona. It means looking at the mask and asking what you put it on to protect yourself from. It means digging into the shadow and acknowledging the feelings you buried there. It means sitting with the discomfort of being real when real is not what people have come to expect from you. There is a reason Jung said it was terrifying, because the confrontation is not with something outside of you. It is not with a difficult person or a hard circumstance. The confrontation is with yourself, with the choices you have been making unconsciously, day after day. The choice to smile when you wanted to say no. The choice to stay when everything inside you was screaming to leave. the choice to keep giving to someone who had stopped giving back. Jung believed these choices accumulate. Every time you override your own instinct in favor of the mask, you send a message to your own psyche. Your needs are not real enough to matter. Your worth is conditional on how well you can perform for others. The psyche internalizes it, and slowly the distance between you and your own soul grows so wide that crossing it begins to feel impossible. But here is what Jung insisted on. That distance is never permanent. The self is not destroyed by the persona. It is buried, and what is buried can be uncovered. Individuation is not building a new self from scratch. It is recovering the self that was always there, waiting under everything you piled on top of it. When you begin to choose yourself, something very specific happens to the social world around you. The people who are benefiting from your self-erasure notice, and they do not always respond with celebration. Sometimes they push back. Sometimes they call you selfish. Sometimes they withdraw the approval that was keeping the whole system running. And this is where choosing yourself feels less like growth and more like grief, because it is grief. The death Jung described when a person finally turns toward their own soul is that second, necessary kind, the voluntary one. The version of you that was performing for the crowd, earning its right to exist by being useful, agreeable, small, that version has to end. Letting it die is not clean. It is not comfortable. It feels like loss because something real is ending. But Jung was firm on this. That loss is not a crisis. That loss is the beginning. There is a friction in this process worth sitting with. The I and the we are always in tension. We are social creatures. The pressure to conform, to fit in, to maintain harmony is wired into us deeply. Jung did not dismiss this, but he also saw what it costs when the we completely swallows the I. A person who exists entirely in service of the collective loses their center. They lose the still point from which real connection is even possible. The very thing people sacrifice themselves to achieve, love and belonging, becomes harder to access the more they sacrifice themselves for it. Because real connection requires two real people. If one of them has disappeared behind a mask, what is connecting? Two masks do not create intimacy. They create performance. This is why choosing yourself is not the enemy of love. It is the prerequisite for it. Jung worked with a composite patient profile that appears again and again in his clinical notes. Consider a person who has lost what Jung called their center, someone who has spent so long adapting to the needs of others they cannot answer basic questions about themselves. What do I want? What do I believe? What matters to me? The answers have been buried under years of accommodation. Jung would not rush this person toward affirmations. He would go in the opposite direction. He would ask them to sit with the discomfort of not knowing. He would guide them toward the shadow, not away from it. Because in that buried anger and those silenced needs was evidence of a self that had always existed. A self that simply had been told over and over that its value was conditional on what it could do for others. The work of reclaiming that self is the work of individuation, and it is exactly as hard as it sounds. Now, we arrive at the turning point. There is a moment Jung described that is impossible to fully prepare for, but impossible to miss when it arrives. It is the moment a person stops waiting for external permission to exist. The moment they stop measuring their worth by what others need from them. The moment they look at the life they have built around other people's comfort and finally ask the one question they have been afraid to ask: what about me? Here it is important to be precise about what Jung meant, because choosing yourself can sound like ego gratification, like simply doing what you want. That is not what Jung was describing. In his framework, the self with a capital S is not the ego. It is something deeper, the archetype of wholeness that the ego must learn to listen to and ultimately submit to. When Jung spoke about turning toward yourself, he meant turning toward the demands of that deeper self, toward the parts of your authentic nature that the persona and the social world have been drowning out. It is less about getting what you want, and more about finally hearing what you actually are. That question is deceptively simple. For someone who has spent years orienting their entire psychology around others, asking "what about me?" is not casual. It is a psychological earthquake. Everything built on the foundation of the false self starts to shift. What follows is not immediately peaceful. It is often disorienting, often lonely, often accompanied by guilt, because the systems around this person were relying on them to stay small. But something else happens too. A clarity arrives. Jung described it as the moment a person moves from being a victim of their own psychology to the author of it. The difference between being pushed around by unconscious patterns, by the demands of the persona, and the suppressed poison of the shadow, and actually directing your own inner life. This is not arrogance. It is not selfishness. It is what Jung called the integration of the self, the bringing together of the parts that were split off and buried, the acknowledgement that you are a complete person with legitimate needs, legitimate limits, and a legitimate right to exist on your own terms. When this integration begins, the relationships in a person's life reveal their true nature quickly. The connections built on genuine mutual respect survive and often deepen. The connections built on exploitation, on the expectation that this person would always sacrifice and never ask for anything in return, those cannot survive the shift. They were never real to begin with, and this is one of the most painful gifts of choosing yourself. The clarity about what was actually there. Jung was honest that this clarity does not feel like a gift at first. When you begin to see which relationships were built on your willingness to disappear, the initial feeling is not relief, it is grief. Because when you are finally real and still feel alone, you have to face whether the people around you were ever truly there for you at all. Jung would say, face it, because the alternative, returning to the mask after you have glimpsed the real thing, costs more every time. The mask fits a little less well, the shadow grows a little darker, the distance from your own soul stretches a little wider. The path forward is not backward, the path forward is through. Jung spent years studying what the result of successful individuation looked like, and the word he kept returning to was not happiness, it was wholeness. A person who has done this work does not become invulnerable or fearless. They do not stop feeling pain or loss, but they stop abandoning themselves in response to it. They develop a stable, honest connection to who they actually are that does not need external approval to hold itself up. When they say yes, it is a real yes. When they say no, it holds. That is what Jung meant by self-realization, not self-promotion. The direct experience of your own reality, of knowing what you value and living in alignment with it. Self-worth built this way is not fragile. It is rooted in the experience of having looked at yourself honestly, including the shadow, including the parts you were told to hide, and having chosen yourself anyway. Jung wrote that individuation is not the achievement of perfection, it is the achievement of authenticity, and he believed authenticity, real, costly, hard-won authenticity, was the only foundation on which a human life could stand without eventually collapsing. This brings us to the final truth. True self-worth is not found. It is built. It is built through every moment you choose honesty when a lie would have been easier. Every time you hold a boundary when the pressure to dissolve it is overwhelming. Every time you sit with the discomfort of the shadow instead of running from it. Every time you take the mask off, even when it is terrifying, and let yourself be seen as you actually are. Jung knew this work was hard. He did not pretend otherwise. He went through his own profound psychological crisis, documented in what became known as his Red Book, confronting the contents of his own unconscious directly. He came out not unchanged, but whole in a way he had not been before. He spent the rest of his life guiding others through the same territory. The courage to stand alone, to be real when the easier path would be to keep performing, is not a small thing. Jung believed it was the central task of a human life, not to become what others need you to be, not to earn your worth through usefulness, but to become who you actually are, fully and without apology. That is not selfishness. That is the most important work you will ever do. So let me ask you something. Right now, in this moment, think about one place in your life where you are still choosing the mask over yourself. One relationship or situation where you are still performing instead of being real. One part of your shadow that you have been avoiding, because acknowledging it would mean choosing yourself in a way that feels risky. Jung would say that place, that exact uncomfortable place, is where your growth is waiting. The brutal truth about self-worth is that no one can give it to you. Not a partner, not a parent, not a therapist, not a viewer count or a job title, or a number in a bank account. Self-worth comes from the daily, unglamorous, courageous act of choosing yourself, of saying, quietly and firmly, and without needing anyone else to understand, I am here, I am real, and I am enough. You were not put here to disappear into other people's needs. Jung knew it, and somewhere underneath everything you have been carrying, you know it too. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.